Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shora Makaremi. I am an anthropologist and CNRS researcher at the HESS in Paris. Although I'm virtually in front of the Museum of History of Kiev, where the Kipchak women's stone statues have been covered for protection since late February. On behalf of the Executive Committee of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar and fundraiser dedicated to the Trypillia megasites. We are extremely excited and honored that world-leading archaeologists have accepted our invitation to share some knowledge of this Ukrainian heritage at a moment when the war waged by Russia is both putting this heritage, like all other dimensions of life, at danger, but also maybe making the teachings and questions addressed to us by this Neolithic past specifically relevant. This webinar focuses on the Trypillia megasites located in today's Ukraine as sites of knowledge that must be protected, but that can also protect us from the epistemic and political foundations of the global security architecture and our over-militarized yet impotent societies. Indeed, the vestiges of the megasites built 6 to 7 millennia ago have raised interest and attention. As case studies, they opened an empirical field and raised new questions for the writing of an urban prehistory and history that challenges our understanding of social organization and power, as The Dawn of Everything, recently published by late David Graeber and David Wengrow, highlights. So we are very lucky to be hearing today two leading experts of the Trypillia megasites, Biserka Gajdarska and John Chapman, and David Wengrow kindly accepted to discuss this presentation and further develop maybe the ways in which he and David Graeber engaged with this path-breaking scholarship. And actually, David Wengrow didn't accept, but was the one who suggested this organization. And we thank him very much for this. It is timely to explore what Trypillia megasites can teach us and to seize hold of their memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger, to paraphrase Walter Benjamin. And I'm referring here to the work to Benjamin's work on the concept of history, and more specifically, the sixth thesis, which has been abundantly quoted, where Benjamin writes, I quote him, "To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger." And this is where he continues with stating that only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. So following this idea of articulating the past historically as a way of engaging with the present and not letting the enemy win, the idea of this webinar was born from a question that I had after finding out about the megasites in Kiev's Museum of History and reading The Dawn of Everything published last year. And this question is how this rediscovered past can resonate with and maybe help us make sense of the Ukrainian resistance and its tradition of auto-organization illustrated during and after the Maidan Revolution, and that we see at play in the territorial defense as well. So I don't know if this question makes sense to our speakers and to you as much as it does for me, but we will find out very soon. This event is part of a series of fundraisers organized by the EASA in support of Ukraine, and the next one in fall 2022 will explore the impact of the war on the global south and global economy in relation specifically to the food crisis. A first event last June discussed the humanitarian and refugee crisis at Ukraine's border in the EU wider context and politics of refugee protection and non-protection. And our panelists highlighted at the time the double standards and spectacles of generosity that were at play. But another idea that emerged was that this war is a moment when fixed status quos are challenged. Things that were considered impossible become possible, and political and social inventions also at our play. So struggle and resistance is very concrete, as our Ukrainian Polish colleagues will remind us in a minute, but it is also intellectually rooted in this act of questioning and widening up the horizon of what did or can take place. This is precisely why, as social scientists who work on contemporary issues, we wanted so much to hear and learn from colleagues working in this other end of anthropology, that is archaeology, inspired by the interdisciplinary discussion that was initiated by David Wengro and David Graeber's seminal book. We need to shaken up our horizon, to sharpen our intellectual tools in order to properly take up to the challenge of maintaining hope while the war is lasting. And I know that the 6th of July is not the best of dates to organize a webinar, and I thank our speakers who generously clear some time to be with us today. Summer leave is here, but the temporality of war knows no pause or seasonal calendar. And while the war may well be still raging in fall, we could not wait this long to draw attention and ask for your solidarity towards community initiatives who are raising funds for the protection of our Ukrainian colleagues currently engaged in the resistance. So without further ado, I would like to open this webinar by welcoming our colleagues who are leading one of such initiatives in Poland. For bureaucratic reasons, the webinar registration fees could not be linked to their crowdfunding, but you can contribute to the ArchaeoEd initiatives through the link that we are providing in the chat and on our website. To very briefly present this action, I will give the floor to Lukasz Barkowiak and also Marcin Loniczak, who are archaeologists at the Museum of Archaeology of Poznan. We also invited Alexander Shelechan, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Archaeology at the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, and a member of the Territorial Defense currently deployed in Donbass. Unfortunately, Alexander cannot make it with us, but he sent us a video that we will be screening. So please, Lucas and Martin, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for ability to present our thing that we are organizing. I would like to share the screen with a short presentation about our project. We are talking about aid for Ukrainian archaeologists from Homeland Defense. It is the idea that comes to us because of a lot of information about everything that archaeologists from Ukraine needs in territorial defense. So we start to do something to collect the money for them. Our museum that we are representing, Archaeological Museum in Poznan, have strongest tradition of cooperation with Ukraine. Here you have a few exhibitions connected with Ukrainian territory. One of them, made in Kiev, Archaeology of Everyday Life, was exhibition that should be presented now, but it's not happened because of war, exactly. Our cooperation was also connected with excavations, both on the Ukrainian side and on the Polish side, some lectures, some familiar publications and something like this. And when war starts, we start to invite our Ukrainian colleagues to come to take their families to us. It gives us a lot of projects that was connected with education, as you can see here with Ukrainian childs. But main thing that we have to do is collection and demand everything that they need. So we need helmets, we need flashlights, binoculars, bulletproof vests, as you can see, first aid kits, wound dressings, everything that can save the life of these persons. Of course, there is a lot of logistic problems, gasoline bills and something like this. So everything that we collect in this fundraiser is going to this AIDS, as you can see. There is a lot of photographies of our soldiers that we support, as you can see here. And one of them, Alexander Shelehan, is this guy who starts everything. So now I would like to introduce him in his own video. Thank you very much for my speech.
Hello everyone, dear friends. I'm very pleased that I have an opportunity to speak on behalf of the Ukrainian archaeological community, and I'm thankful to the organizers for the invitation to this event. I'm recording this video not knowing where I will be on July 6th. The same could be told about the whole of our country. Instead of planning projects, expedition trips, and vacation, we were forced to live by one day, fighting not just for our land, but for the very existence of the Ukrainian nation. As I can tell, from 6 to 800,000 Ukrainians stand with weapons since February 24, and nearly 40 archaeologists take part in our war for independence. My colleagues serve in different units of the armed forces, National Guard, and territorial defense. For example, I can mention Alexander Smirnov, a university lecturer who took part in the 2014 campaign, and back then he was injured defending Savur Mohyla, a step mound where, according to the folklore songs, one of the Cossack chiefs died in battle as a hero. And today Alexander commands a platoon defending his hometown Mykolaiv on the shores of the Black Sea. Another story could be told is about Igor Shevchenko, an archaeologist who actually worked as a miner in a metal ore mine. Being on duty in 2015, he lived in a bunker built in a kurgan, so he managed to explore Bronze Age burial while constructing the living quarter. And today, since the first days of the invasions, he stands at the northern borders defending our capital, Kiev. And as for me, a couple of years ago, I started to survey the settlement structure of the Scythian period, concentrating on the Nemiriv Hillfort, one of the biggest enclosures in Eastern Europe. This field season, 22 field season, was supposed to be the next step in exploring the region. Also, I was interested in studying the Scythian weapon and warfare, as well in the social structure and warriors' rights. So today, I've got first-hand experience in this matter. As the military appeared to be like a truly ethnographic expedition. For example, I can see potlatch and gift given as act of social connection within the group. Also, mystical beliefs in unity with idealized mythical ancestors, and of course the desire of gaining the afterlife together with fallen brothers as a manifestation of PTSD. All these stories and many others could be told later near the campfire or could be used in future researcher works. But before that, we have to win. Though our army has tripled since February, our needs have increased by 10 times more than we can afford. So today we found ourselves at the edge between two worlds. On one side is a horde of marauders who organize concentration camps, rape women, girls, and children, and for some unknown reason stole toilet bowls from the Ukrainian homes. They are miserable, but they are numerous. On another side, we have free people of the West who support us with weapon, ammunition, medicine, etc., etc. Together we are defending our common values and way of life, and I hope we will stay united in the future. Here I want to mention the fundraising campaign forced by our colleagues from Poznan. During the first couple of months, we managed to provide individual targeted help for archaeologists in war. This includes mostly helmets, bulletproof plates, and uniforms. But unfortunately, the donation drops almost to zero in recent days as news from the front line became less spicy and intriguing. But at the same time, after closing questions about the individual equipment, we met new needs. Modern warfare require modern and very expensive tools such as drones, thermal cameras, night vision goggles, and of course all-wheel drive vehicles. All this stuff aimed to action with rapid maneuvering, surveillance, and artillery guidance. So taking this opportunity, I want to address my call to all foreign colleagues. Please arm Ukraine now. We don't want you to fight instead of us. We don't search for your pity and compassion. We're just asking for help to win back our independence and to possess our ground in the family of free nations. Thank you for your attention. Glory to Ukraine and Slava Ukraini.
I mute. Okay, so donations have almost dropped to zero, Alexander reminds us. So to change this, you can either find the link to the crowdfunding in the chat or go to the webinars page on the website. And now is the time to be fed some food for thought and relate to ruins and to excavations, not through distress and anger, but through gay path-breaking knowledge. And I'm honored to welcome Biserka Gajdarska and John Chapman. Biserka Gajdarska is a postdoctoral researcher for the project Radiocarbon, Big Data Integrated Cross-National Heritage Histories at Manchester Metropolitan University. She graduated from Sofia University and completed a PhD at Durham University on landscape archaeology in Bulgaria. She was a postdoctoral researcher and co-director on the project entitled Early Urbanism in Prehistoric Europe, the case of the Ukrainian Trypillia megasites, and was the author and main editor of the project monograph published in 2020. John Chapman is Emeritus Professor of European Prehistory at Durham University. He has spent his career working on archaeological theory and later Balkan prehistory, co-directing major field projects in Croatia, Hungary, and in Ukraine with the Trypillia megasite project. He was the first editor of the European Journal of Archaeology and served as a vice president for the UK Prehistoric Society. He recently published 2 books that are complementary. One synthesis of his Balkan research entitled Forging Identities in the Prehistory of Old Europe, published in 2020, and the same year, a memoir entitled A Life in Balkan Prehistory. So thank you very much, Biserka and John, for being here today, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting us and for organizing this seminar, which is rather emotional for us. I need to share my screen first. Let's see whether this will work now. Give me a minute to do that. We've tried it and it works, so it should work again. Can you see that, please?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Double click.
How about now?
Yes, brilliant.
Oh, there. Thank you very much. Okay, so it did work. So we have been associated with Ukraine for over 10 years, and we feel a deep and emotional bond to the country in its time of suffering. We are deeply disturbed in the way that the Russian history curriculum is being imposed to Donbass schools, and wish to underline our support for independent, critical history, of which one example is the story of Trypillia megasites. The first part of our presentation will be brief and a potted history of Trypillia, one of the prehistoric networks in Europe, and a specific aspect of this group, namely the so-called megasites. We do so by focusing on one site, the site of Nebelivka. But this is only will be scratching the surface. If you're interested, then we direct you to the now many publications in various languages: Ukrainian, Russian, English, and German. The second part is something that we present for the first time. So it will be interesting to hear what do you think about our suggestion. The Trypillia network, colloquially known as Trypillia culture, occupied a vast area in what is now present-day Ukraine, and also Romania and Moldova, where the same phenomenon is called Cucuteni. The Trypillia network is not only vast, but is also one of the longest, if not the longest, lasting network in prehistoric Europe. Estimates of the number of sites varies according to the various sources, but 5,000 is an acceptable compromise. These 5,000 sites were spread across 5 periods: A, B1, B2, C1, and C2, and today we will be concentrating on B2, or the beginning, in other words, the beginning, the first 200 to 300 years of the 4th millennium BC. Trypillia is entirely dominated by settlements, and formal cemeteries are known towards the end of this group. A peculiar feature of Trypillia, but which is not so uncommon in prehistory of Eastern Europe, is that their houses were deliberately burned at the end of their life cycle. These pictures are from the experimental house that our project built and then burnt. We are not going to talk about this today, but we are more than happy to answer any questions later. If we have to sum up the Trypillia in 3 words, it would be world of clay, epitomized by their houses, figurines, and exquisitely made and decorated pottery. Other materials like flint, stone, and metal are also known, but in much smaller quantities. A distinctive feature of Trypillia, but not Cucuteni, is the emergence and sustained choice of large sites. The exact percentage may vary, but the overall pattern is of critical mass of small sites and small but persistent number of large sites. And what you see in the screen is one of the early geophysics that show how these sites look like. This is the same information presented in a different way that visualizes the development of these huge sites in time. A crucial point I'd like to make here, and we'll pick up this in the second part of the talk, is that such pattern may be perceived as hierarchical in terms of size. And indeed, such arguments have been put forward with the implication that this also means social hierarchy. Due to time constraints, we'll not be able to get into the detail for the counter arguments for that, but I'll mention just 2 key points. On current evidence, 3 of the largest sites are not only located at 20 kilometers from each other, but also they overlap for a certain period. And secondly, the hinterland of at least one, or most probably all 3 large sites, has hardly any smaller contemporary sites. We have provided sizes for these large sites, but let's put such sizes in context. This is the site of Nebelivka that we have worked at from 2009 onwards, and under it is the medieval city in Frankfurt. Both sites are at the same scale. I'll leave you to make your own conclusions. How were and how are these sites perceived? Very revealing in that sense is their name. They have been called and continue to be widely named as settlement giants, which refers to their size but gives nothing about their social underpinning. Since the opening of Ukrainian archaeology to Western projects, the discussion about their nature has intensified, and currently there is no consent of what they really are, with each group of scholars pretty much staying with their initial perception despite the wealth of new information. On the one end of the spectrum is the settlement giants interpretation. On the opposite end is the view of the earliest cities in Europe. And in between, you can find concepts as agricultural towns, agglomerated sites, or overrun villages. We'll have no time even to summarize the main points of this debate, but I'd like to draw your attention to 2 points mentioned on this slide that we'll come back to it later: mobility and village type of economy that underpins such sites. We believe that there has been a conceptual and methodological revolution in the last 10 years with the introduction of interdisciplinary approach to the investigation of megasites. This is an interpretative plot of the high precision geophysics plan of Nebelivka, and the little rectangles that you see are buildings. The oval plan consisting of concentric house circuits has been known from old geophysics, like you saw before, and aerial photographs. But some new features came to light. For example, perimeter ditches like that, paleo channels, tracks that we don't have in Nebelivka, but they're being identified on other sites, pit clusters like this, unburned houses, that was a little bit of surprise to find out, larger than usual houses that we call assembly houses, bounded unbuilt spaces, which are not only these are between the two circuits, but like this or like that. Regularly occurring household clusters, which we call neighborhoods, and the number of dwellings in a neighborhood may vary between 3 and 47, and larger ensemble of houses, which we called quarters. And all of that made us think that there is a much greater degree of internal spatial use of space than we previously thought. But also, we also realized that unless we have a good chronological command of that, this is all superficial. That the plan may the integrity of the plan may be superficial. The new plans, however, were perceived with the old explanation, namely that all structures, almost 1,500 in Nebelivka, were built at the same time, burnt at the same time. That meant massive occupation, that had village-type economy, and the only social order that can account for that is a hierarchical order. Our interdisciplinary approach did not fit any of these assumptions. Starting from what you've just seen, the zoomed and overall plans of Nebelivka, there is far too much variability to easily accept top-down hierarchy. Our attempt to fine-tune the chronology of the site with more than 80 AMS dates was hampered by the nature of the calibration curve that produces this inconclusive distribution. We could say when the site was founded and ceased to exist, but otherwise, the dates are statistically indistinguishable. Since we know that the site has lasted about 200 years, and there is no evidence thus far that any prehistoric dwelling in Europe to have been in use for more than 50 years, the modeling of our colleague Andrew Millers has suggested that 1/3 to 1/6 of all of the buildings were in contemporary use at any given time. That questions the first 2 points on this slide. Now let's look at the permanence and the village type subsistent. This is a sediment core that we have taken from the vicinity of the site to perform a variety of analysis. The shaded area here is the time when Nebelivka was occupied. We were very surprised to see that the expected massive deforestation to account for all the timber needed to build the 1,500 structures did not appear, somewhere here. there wasn't also sustained subsequent deforestation to correspond for wood for daily needs for that many people. If anything, you can see that there is actually forest comes back. There was also no massive deforestation towards the end of the occupation for the timber needed for the burning of that many structures, which is somewhere here. This latter point is confirmed by the amount of macro charcoal that, although present, cannot account for a massive final fire. These are here. If anything, there is more macro charcoal in the beginning of the occupation of Nebelivka. But perhaps most astonishing of all was the negligible amount of cereal pollen, about here. It is indeed present, but would have been insufficient to feed that many people. So, faced with that evidence, we had no choice but to seek an alternative. We developed 3 different models, and John will talk about them more later. One of the models envisaged small permanent occupation, while the other 2 are based on the premise of a different type of temporary or seasonal occupation. But all 3 models had to account for the number of houses built, the number of houses burned. Whatever burning and building was taking place should not have produced a massive environmental impact and should not go beyond the constraints of the AMS states. So current research on the visualization of these 3 models is ongoing. So in cooperation with David Piscatelli and Ayel Weitzman, we have tried to do some visualization, and now is the tricky moment in which I'll try to show you something which worked when we tried it. So let's hope it will try now. Okay, play. Is it working now? Oh no.
Play is in the middle at the bottom.
Yes, it is working now. So what we see on the screen is the idea that the first circles that you saw, these are communal features, whether that will be kilns or communal cooking features, that is still a debate. And from there, the circuits emerge by connecting the assembly houses, the ones that I have mentioned previously. So the assembly house location, these big things in here, to each of the quarters that we also saw previously. The gray areas highlight where the activity is taking place, and the circles popping around the site are the origins of the spread for each year, if you imagine that was happening in each year. So the white circles are the unburned dwellings, and the red is the burned dwellings. And as you can see, the more we go into to the end, most of it gets burned. So we're just in the experimental phase. Watch that space. We're producing more of these. Okay, so why isn't it working? Oh, can you see my next slide? Ah, yes. So whenever I'm giving a similar talk, I would like to show this slide, as it has the place where I was born, Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, and the place at the bottom, and the place where I live now, Durham, in the UK. These 2 places could not be more different, and yet they're both cities. And nobody seems to have a problem with this because different criteria is used in their classification. One is a capital, the other one has a cathedral. And why is then that we want to use one overarching criteria for cities in the past? Of course, I'm not the first to come up with this question, and the sociologist Louis Wirth has posed it as early as 1930s. But what currently dominates in archaeology is another view of Wirth for cities as places with dense population, Gordon Childs' checklist, Michael Smith's functional definition, or combination of the above. What we are proposing instead is to think about cities in relational terms rather than absolutely. That urban and non-urban forms co-emerge with each other, and that the urban settlements stand out from their previous and contemporary sites along several lines that will be listed on the next slide. But probably the most striking feature of the megasites is their scale of operation. And here I draw your attention to the little blob here, which is a normal site. How can one possibly compare what was taking place here daily, weekly, annually, with what was happening at the megasite, in this case, the Belivka? And it is in this sense that we see the Belivka as standing out and thus as an early urban form. And before I give the floor to John, I would like to reiterate that megasites cannot be considered as the very large examples of small communities. That would be the same to say that aircraft carriers are simply bigger version of yachts. In comparison with small Trypillia settlements, megasites are so different that they indeed can be thought as cities. And these are the 9 lines in relational terms along which we think we can make such claim. And at this point, we change seats with John coming and taking over.
Hello. In the second part, then, we're going to do something that has been tried before on a small scale, but never really on the largest scale of the Trypillia megasite, and that is to seek a view of the political dimensions of Trypillia megasites. And as you'll see very shortly and throughout this second half, this has very much been inspired by David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, and you'll see many of the key points that they make in this book coming out as a framework for the views that we're going to put forward. I start with a curious place, actually. It's a 1930s cultural anthropological term, a theoretical term, cultural schismogenesis. But in the context of today's seminar, it's perhaps not so strange, because what this means is the tendency for people to define themselves versus one another. And so the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, in a very dramatic and extreme sense, a form of cultural schismogenesis. And the point about this in Trypillia terms is that the point already made by Bitteker, that it is such a vast network, both in time and space, that in fact there was very little cultural schismogenesis within the Trypillia area. It was, broadly speaking, quite a similar network over a vast amount of time and space. And the Cucteni Trypillia cultural values were inscribed in what we've called their big other. And the big other is a term derived ultimately from Lacan through Slavoj Žižek. And it's a term which means that it has to be sufficiently general and significant to attract the support of most members of society. If most people don't believe in it, then it doesn't work. But at the same time, and this is the key element, the big other was sufficiently ambiguous to allow localized interpretations which avoid schismatic behavior, which avoid cultural schismogenesis. And this is what enabled Cucteni Trypillia then to develop in such a large area, because most communities inside it were never exposed to anything except Cucteni Trypillia and the Big Other. And this was what led to long-term cultural stability, which at the same time allowed regional variations in pottery, houses, and figurines, the material basis of the Big Other. And the other key feature about the Big Other, which we'll come back to in political terms in a moment, is the strong resistance to personal accumulation. And you can, I think, imagine how this had a strong political effect, because there were very few rich burials and very little hoarding of the kind that we know from other areas of Southeast Europe. Now, in The Dawn of Everything, the two Davids propose three forms of freedom, mobility, of freedom. That's to say, mobility, disobedience, and imagination. And we can see all of these three operating in Trypillia terms. When it comes to mobility, if people wanted to move away, they needed networks of mutual aid and hospitality. And in this sense, then, the Cucteni Trypillia Big Other can be thought of as an extended moral community which would offer such support and mutual aid to people who moved around. In terms of disobedience, the model which the Davids propose is the open Wendat style of public decision-making, a non-authoritarian form of decision-making for communities, which allowed difference, disagreement, and disobedience. And we suggest that this is enshrined in the plan of the Trypillia megasite, and especially its inner open area, which is absolutely fundamental to the growth of such places. And here's another one example from an earlier kind of geophysics. So it's not just, does this work?
Yes, yes.
You can see here the central area of this site, just like Nebelivka, but on a different site. And the third point about freedom was the freedom to imagine different kinds of social reality. And this we've talked about earlier in terms of imagined communities. Cities had to start as a form of imagined communities, because before cities there were no such agglomerations of people, no such huge concentrations, congregations of people. Just the same way that Canetti talks about cities that begin in the mind. So all of these three forms of freedom that the Davids talk about, in fact, are clearly identifiable in Trypillia. They also talk about three forms of domination, and each form could develop into its own kind of institutional aspect. Violence into sovereignty, specialist or esoteric knowledge into administration. We love the bureaucrats. Charismatic power into heroic politics. Let's not mention Boris Johnson. Of the first, the violence, one of the principal Ukrainian investigators, Mikhailo Videko, suggested in 2007 that Trypillia chiefdoms were in a state of perpetual internecine warfare. And when we read this account, we really began to wonder, what was the evidence for this? What is the basis for this? And indeed, remember, Biseka mentioned 5,000 sites. There's one site that has evidence of an archery attack. Drutsi 1, you must have heard of it. And there's the kind of projectile points that were found in large numbers at Drutsi 1. The other kind of evidence is a longer term, more general sort of comment, the ratio of fortified to non-fortified sites. What do we mean by this? We mean essentially very large ditches around sites. There's an example of the ditches in the middle, and the sites where you find the ditches, you can see them on the plots. So not really, in fact, very much evidence for violence and intercommunal violence in Trypillia or Cucuteni, indeed. When it comes to specialist knowledge, we would certainly agree that there is special ritual knowledge, special pottery production information, and special knowledge about buildings. But the point about these is that they all form part of the Trypillia Big Other, and there's a very significant knowledge dispersion which stops concentration of this specialist knowledge in a small number of people. And as we'll see when we come on to look at the three kinds of models we proposed, there are actually rather limited opportunities for charismatic individuals to consolidate their relations into long-term power relations. So I think that the forms of violence, of domination in Trypillia are actually rather restrained, but they're part of the structural constraints of the Trypillia settlement network. So, thinking of burnt man, this remarkably non-bureaucratic, egalitarian form of settlement, seasonal settlement, this made us think very much of Trypillia assemblage sites. Biseka mentioned the three main models that we've suggested in opposition to the permanent long-term huge populations model. And the first one is a distributed governance model, which envisages 10 clans in a regional alliance, all of whom control operations at the megasite for 1 year before passing on to the next. So it's that sort of model, the centripetal model, with the clans moving in, providing resources and decision-making on a clan council, perhaps, and benefiting clearly from the opportunities of running a megasite. But because they don't continue, this controls centralized power over the longer term. One of the questions in this model is the question of how to stop freeloaders, people who benefit from 8 years of other clans' work and efforts and then don't put in what they do. That's a bit serious question for the model. But how does this work for egalitarian political organization? Well, as I say, the annual replacement of the dominant lineage constrained the ability of any one lineage to establish permanent control over decision-making. So there's always this fluidity, which I think is very important when it comes to maintaining an egalitarian base. And in fact, most of the other lineages were focusing on their own particular local identity in settlements around the area for most of the year. So there's an awful lot of decision-making that didn't take place at Nebelivka or other megasites. What happened there was that the dominant lineage maintained continuity of decision-making for the big issues of the day, the big other issues of the day, through meetings in the inner open area. Now, the second model we've proposed is called the assembly model, an assembly season of 1 month per year. So 11 months when people were out there in smaller sites doing their own thing. So this was a highly concentrated period of interaction with some of the things going on like that. Probably not everybody dressed that way. So it was a really major event in the regional calendar, something everyone looked forward to every year. However, there was this tension that came out in the 1 month between the overall megasite identity and the local community identities, the communal identities that visitors brought to them when they came to the megasite. And this shows up in all the architectural and planning variations that Bisseka mentioned just now. That's a very good explanation of why that should be. So in terms of egalitarian organization, this tension then is another way of constraining central political power. And the tension was not necessarily resolved permanently, maybe occasionally resolved, but it resurfaced every year in effect. And that's because seasonality was at the core of the model. And again, local decision-making was by far the predominant form of decision-making, because the assembly only took place for a month every year. The permanent residents at Nebelivka, quite a small group, we call them the Nebelivka Guardians, were potentially in a strong position to exploit their position, their centrality. But this could easily have been mitigated by changing the members of the Guardian group. So that's a mitigation that we think was important. Moving on to the third model, the pilgrimage model. This model was rooted, not surprisingly, in the Trypillia Big Other, where shared rituals and ceremonies were concentrated in the pilgrimage centers, the megasites. And here's an example of processing into the megasites. Now, the pilgrimage season was not such an intensive interaction as the assemblies, because it went on for 6, 7, 8 months of the year. But it was still extremely important on a regional level, not least because a massive communal effort was needed to construct the pilgrimage center in the first place. And this vast place then was enough to attract visitors from far and wide. Indeed, the processional routes helped to explain many of the planning features of this quite distinctive form of city. Again, what aspects of the egalitarian organization come out of the pilgrimage model? Well, there were two problems then for consensual decision-making. One is the length of the season, the 8-month season. At any one time, 90% of the people making decisions were absent from those decision-making events in the inner urban area. So there were always people at their home base for most of the year. So the mitigation to this was that the key decision-making was grounded in the precepts of the Big Other. And there were enough people there in the Nebelivka Guardians to set this agenda and make sure it didn't stray. There was, however, the potential for the Nebelivka Guardians to centralize things. So that's another question about this model. But what I've done then is to take you through a series of egalitarian political organizations based on the 3 models that we've proposed, which give you a flavor for how the overall political arrangements could have taken place on Trypillia megasites. So I better wrap up now before we pass over to David Wengro for what is certainly going to be an interesting discussion. And the first point is that the new AMS dates that we and others have produced suggest a 200-year occupation for at least 3 major megasites. So it's clear that these mitigations did actually work. It seems extremely likely that the seasonal or sequential settlement at the megasites underpinned an egalitarian political organization. We've never really brought this out strongly before, but in the view of David and David's political suggestions, it does seem to be a resoundingly obvious conclusion. And we presented 3 alternative models. We don't feel obliged in any way to decide between one or the other or the third, because each has advantages and disadvantages. And there is this ambiguity as much as in the big other in our explanations for that. But they all work in terms of egalitarian models. And so what we're proposing here is a Graberian-Wengrovian vision for Trypillia megasites, which resulted in an egalitarian, low-density urbanism on the Ukrainian forest steppe. Thank you very much. There's some acknowledgement to many of you here. And finally, we can leave this up or distribute it. There's some references, which are so small that you probably can't read them, but there they are. And that's all we have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Biserka and John. I feel absolutely lucky to have been witnessing or hearing this conversation that is actually a way of conversing back with David Wengrow and David Graeber upon what they build, also based on your work, and it's so it's a transfer and counter transfer of knowledge that is quite inspiring and moving to be a witness of. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce David Wengrow, who is a professor of comparative archaeology at the University College in London. David Wengrow has conducted archaeological fieldwork in Africa and the Middle East, and has been a visiting professor at NYU, the Universities of Auckland and Freiburg. And of course, he's the co-author with David Graeber of the international bestseller, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. This book has inspired many of us throughout countries, disciplines, in and out of the academia. A chapter of the book explores Eurasia's first urbanites and how societies in China, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Ukraine have built cities without kings, as you worded. They notably rely on John and Biserka's work in order to explore how archaeological findings in Ukraine are overturning conventional wisdom on the origins of cities, as to quote you again. So we are very honored to have you with us, David, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chara. Am I audible?
Yes.
No?
Yes, you are.
You can hear me, but John can't. I want to thank you, Chara, for this opportunity to show solidarity with our colleagues in Ukraine. And I want to thank John and Biserka for lending their expertise on the Ukrainian megasites. There's very little I can say that they haven't already covered, and I'm hardly going to dispute a Graberian, Wengrovian interpretation of them. So I just thought I'd make some brief comments on why I really love the Ukrainian megasites and what I think they stand for, and why they've been so central to a kind of rethinking of the way we do history and archaeology, which I tried to engage in together with my late colleague, David Graeber, for the past 10 years or more. The basic reason why we both loved the Ukrainian megasites so much is that they're really a big 2 fingers up, or 1 finger up, or a poke in the eye, depending where you come from, in the general direction of those theorists who for generations have been trying to convince us all that the most important thing that people ever got up to in past periods of human history was somehow trying, and largely failing, to construct the modern nation state. And that the success or the failure of past societies in this strange endeavor is what should mark them out as either significant players in history or evolutionary dead ends that we might as well never have found out about in the first place. In fact, the first time that the topic of the megasites came up in conversation with David is something I remember quite well, because it was such an odd and quite funny sort of conversation. he asked me if I was aware of anything like an egalitarian city in the archaeological record. I described the megasites, or what I knew of them back then. But then I pointed out to him, so this is about 10 years ago, that I wasn't aware of a single archaeologist who was ready to call them cities. Why not? He naturally asked. They're about the right size when you compare them to other very large settlements that people are quite happy to call cities, for instance, in the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia or China or Mesoamerica. Well, I explained, it's because they don't present any clear signs at all of being on the way to becoming states, which for most archaeologists is a sign of simplicity rather than complexity. And cities are assumed to be a sign of social complexity. And complexity in archaeology is usually supposed to mean hierarchy. Even worse, the megasites don't seem to have been particularly organized around the production of commodities or the centralization of labor for trade. So we can't even really apply any of the usual models of core and periphery of big commercial centers, sending out colonies and flooding their neighbors with mass-produced goods. We had a good time reviewing the literature on these sites and the various euphemisms that archaeologists were using to describe them, or rather describe them away into nothingness. Overgrown villages, which Bissaka mentioned, I think was our favorite. So in my 2015 Jack Goody lecture called Cities Before the State in Eurasia, I just went for it and decided to call the megasites cities. And I'm glad to say that largely thanks to John and Bissaka, and also Johannes Müller, who I was just spending some time with the other week in Kiel, it seems to be catching on. Maybe one day they will even feature in one of Norman Yoffe's magnificent Cambridge World Histories of urbanization. But what does it mean to include the megasites within a history of cities? I think it stands for something larger even than the megasites themselves. It stands for a human history that is not teleological, in which people sometimes did things that do not in any way prefigure the kind of blandly uniform global culture that we appear to be stuck with today. And what's more, they did it in style. For more than half a millennium, which is hardly a flash in the pan, and they did it playfully and joyfully. I love the material culture of the Ukrainian megasites, with its female figurines and little house models and stunningly beautiful pottery. As I was explaining to Johannes the other day, it is only after presiding over the excavation of thousands of more or less identical sherds of unpainted beveled rim bowls on an early Mesopotamian city site that you can fully appreciate the sheer joyfulness of Trypillia, Ukraine material culture, its urban effervescence, and its stubborn refusal to fit into any of the theoretical straitjackets that overbearing archaeologists brandishing impressively named theories about scalar stress and energized crowding try to inflict upon them. They remind us that people in all periods of history often found much better things to do with their lives than lay foundations for the kind of violent systems of inequality and exploitation that we so readily grace with terms like state formation and social complexity. The megasites, in short, are liberating to think with in the same way that those peculiar villages of the Neolithic period in Mesopotamia are fun and liberating to think with. Why on earth would a group of people living in a tiny face-to-face village community of about 200 people, like the one excavated in Syria at Tel Sabi Abyad, go to the trouble of inventing a specialized system of administration, along with archives and labeling systems to track the movement of people and goods. Clearly, they weren't trying to build a state, or if they were, it would have been a really, really tiny state. Maybe they were just playing around, experimenting with a new way of doing things. Whatever the reason, the remains of these prehistoric people in the Middle East, with their tiny village bureaucracies thousands of years before cities and the state, remind us, in the same way that the megasites do, that necessity is not always the mother of invention, and that human history is not just one long story about why things have to be the way they are now, and that our job as custodians and interpreters of the past is to sometimes admit what we just don't know and accept the limits of our armchair paradigms. They challenge us to accept the proposition that past human beings were not just simple or deficient versions of ourselves. They had their own schemes and ideas about how to live, and probably their own ideas about what it means to be simple or complex. Of course, they cannot offer us direct models or templates for how to live today. But that is not the point. The point is that they challenge those imperialistic and teleological models of thought, which tell us that the way we live now is the only way possible. They ask to be accepted on their own terms rather than trammeled under the wheels of some theoretical juggernaut. They show us paths not taken, that people in the past, often living in rather similar material circumstances, actually found very different ways to organize themselves, and they challenge us in our current circumstances to do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for this discussion, very enlightening and inspiring. We can take a few questions very shortly. We have 5 minutes left before the end of the webinar. Can you please, those who have questions, maybe ask their questions in the Q&A instead of the chat. And while we are collecting questions, I would just like to talk about, mention an initiative that comes from the museum right in the heart of the megasite territory that we, John and Biserka were talking of, that is the Legacy Museum, which has launched a crowdfunding for the purchase of a quadcopter, which is a drone, for some of the museum's archaeologists. So the link to the crowdfunding is in the chat, and the price of a quadcopter is about 500 euros. So I think that we can make this happen for our colleagues in Legacy Museum in Ukraine. Do we have any questions? There is no questions that I can see, so maybe I can take the opportunity of my position to ask a question, actually, that is not directly maybe related to what has been said today, but is something that I've read, you know, that I've encountered in David Wengrow and David Graeber's book, and also I thought I saw that, or I felt that in the articles that I've read by you, John and Biserka, which is the fact that the question of matriarchy and the feminist approach that is or is not involved in thinking about those non-hierarchical models of organization, because This is something that is very present, I think, in the Dawn of Everything, that has not been maybe engaged with as much as it deserves. The influence of feminist theory on political thinking. But I know that, John, you mentioned that you were not taking a specific feminist approach while looking at the megasites. While at the same time, I felt, but maybe this is a totally an ignorant standpoint, but I felt that by mentioning, by getting back Gimbutas in the picture and talking about old Europe, you're in a way also taking up this legacy or not. So I would like to maybe ask a question around this issue, if you.
Yeah. Well, Maria Gimbutas is a rather polarizing figure, as probably many of you know. But one of the great things that she did, that I think it's her most positive legacy, that she was one of the people, I think the first person to recognize that figurines had a really active role to play in society, and they took part in ceremonies and rituals. And insofar as Trypillia is absolutely full of figurines, sometimes very remarkable ones, then clearly Gimbutas was thinking very much of the impact of Trypillia figurines in everyday social practices. But one of the aspects of Gimbutas's models of Neolithic society is probably not so helpful, and that's that she argued in favor of a matrifocal society on the basis of the figurines very largely, and of the other ritual arguments. And the reason we didn't want to use Gimbutas and the Gimbutasian views to support egalitarian Trypillia social models was that her theorization of the matriarchy and a matriarchal society isn't particularly strong, and has indeed been very widely criticized. So it's not that we don't understand the potential for women in Trypillia societies to play a very important role, because if you're talking about the production of amazing figurines, extraordinary pottery, living in family houses, then the opportunity for women to participate in a very creative and dynamic way is very, very great indeed. But you can argue that without recourse to Gimbutas.
If you mean by feminist approach more like questioning the narrative, the classic narrative of hierarchical society, then yes, probably we are engaging in that kind of shaking up and questioning this male dominated narrative. But we have been in enough trouble as we are trying to move away from what these sites are perceived now, let alone introduce even more layers of how we actually package our alternatives. So, but in principle, I agree with you. It is something which we are saying, well, yeah, there is the scaffolding of what you call feminist approach, and I do agree with you. It's just we never really made the conscious effort to make it a little bit more persuasive in along those lines, because we had many battles to fight anyway. So, but why not? We may take on that one as well.
David, do you have any?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think gender has to be integral to any reconstruction of the political life of any society. I think it was possibly Mari Bookchin once made the point that societies in which men dominate women tend to be societies in which men dominate each other too. There is an implication in the use of the Wendat analogy, which John made, because historically the Wendat could be considered, at least from some perspectives, to be a matriarchal society. Gimbutas, as I think we discussed somewhere in the book, became a sort of focus for a debate that in many ways quite divorced from what she wrote. I mean, I'm glad John used the word matrifocal, because I think she was quite careful not to classify whole societies as matriarchal, despite what some people wrote about her work afterwards. And I think partly because of the acrimony of those debates, as you can sense, prehistorians are quite nervous about talking about this stuff. It's not that there isn't a huge literature on gender. It just tends to be a very sort of self-critical, introspective literature that doesn't really offer a great many interpretations. And I think until we get to the point where we can at least begin to try and offer interpretations, it's going to be very difficult to talk about politics at any level. So I think it's exactly the right question to ask. I can see that John wants to come in.
Yeah. Well, only to agree with you that interpretations along feminist lines are absolutely crucial. But an experience that I found in writing a general synthesis of Balkan prehistory a couple of years ago was that as you expand in scale from a person, a household, a neighborhood, a site, a regional network, an interregional exchange network, the harder it becomes to grapple with the contributions that either men or women made to any particular operation at these different scales. Much easier to talk about feminist approaches when dealing with personhood and with households, and sometimes, but even then, very difficult to talk at a whole site level. But once you go beyond a single site, really difficult to get to grips with what men and women were actually doing, and therefore
And
how
children.
to, not to mention children
And
and old people. Really difficult. So that's the challenge. But you're right, David. It's an important question.
So we are a little bit behind schedule already, but there was a very interesting question in the Q&A on the role of the Trypillia culture and its legacy in the national discourse in Ukraine today, or not. So maybe as a concluding, remark, if you have anything to say to that.
Yeah. As you probably know, archaeology and the emergence of nationalism in the mid to late 19th century AD were quite closely intertwined, and they've remained that way. And so one of the more recent post-Second World War developments of this was the way in which particular networks, cultures, groups were singled out for any particular nation as representatives of the way that they would have been. And so very remarkable sort of hunter-gatherer groups in the Serbian, Romanian Iron Gates Gorge region were considered to be sort of prototypical Serbs at the time of the Third Balkan Wars. So, and the claim that Lepenski Vir was a settlement of the first Serbs was made. And so with Trypillia, there have been 3 exhibitions in the last 10 or 15 years, which put forward the Trypillia as a sort of archetypal Ukrainian culture, which showed the achievements of Ukraine in the past. And you can see from the kind of material culture that David talked about and Biserka illustrated that this is absolutely a classic route to demonstrating your deep commitment to aesthetic values and the strength of your relationship to the past. And that's what you can talk about, as long as you realize that A, Trypillians probably weren't Ukrainians, because that came a lot later, but B, that there is this sort of continuity, and Ukrainians are quite entitled, I think, to refer to what happened in this area in terms of their own identity and in terms of cultural memory. But there is a question mark always over this approach to prehistoric cultures, but it's a very common procedure.
Do you have anything to add, David, to that? So yeah, we're running out of time now, unfortunately. So before ending this incredibly rich webinar, I would like to thank all of our speakers for their presence, their time, their insights, their solidarity. We wish all the best to Alexander and wish him to come back soon to observing 7th century weapons instead of holding one in his hands. We invite you to share widely the crowdfunding links that we put on our websites, and thank you very much for your contributions. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did, and please stay tuned for the next fundraiser and webinar dedicated next fall to the challenges that the Global South and global economy have to face as a result of this insane war of imperial conquest. So on this note, have a nice evening, everyone. Stay safe and see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Cheers, David.
Bye.